looked out and saw this and got very curious, wondering what was happening. And so began to follow him home. And when Michelangelo got home, he took out his hammer and he took out his chisel and he began to hammer away at the boulder. And so the neighbor couldn't stand it anymore. He had to ask, "Why are you hammering on that boulder?" And according to the legend, Michelangelo said, "Because there's an angel trapped inside and I'm trying to let it out." This is a great description of how sculptors go about sculpting. They see something in the rock or the stone and they chip away at it until it reveals itself. It's also, though, I think, a very good metaphor for looking and thinking about the miracles of Jesus. And today we hear about what John, the writer of the Gospel of John, calls Jesus' first miracle, turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. I think it's important for us to stop and think about what we think about miracles, what we think Jesus is doing when he performs a miracle. And quite often what we think is that Jesus has done it so he can show everybody the great power he has, and they will know without a doubt that he has the power and the authority and the right to do what he does. And that seems to be kind of the way the writer of John looks at it too, because in that passage he says that Jesus did this, and it was his first sign, and people saw his glory in it and they began to believe. And so it is easy, even with that reinforcement from the Gospel of John, to see that the purpose of Jesus in doing miracles was to show everybody who he was so they would believe. There's a problem with thinking that way, though. Because if we look at the Gospels of Matthew and of Luke, they, along with the Gospel of Mark, talk about one of the first things Jesus did after being baptized, which began his public ministry, was to be driven out into the wilderness to deal with temptations from Satan. You remember that story? And Mark kind of leaves it at that he had to deal with temptations from Satan, and he stood fast, and then he came out and he had an understanding about how he was to proclaim the message of God's kingdom. Matthew and Luke go into a little more detail. They actually name 2 or 3 of the temptations. And the first temptation they name is that Satan tempted him to strike a rock and turn it to bread. Take those stones and turn them to bread, Satan says. Not only will you have food, but you can feed the whole world with it, and everybody will know you're the Son of God. Fleeing yourself from a temple. But this, take that stone and turn it to bread, is an awful lot like take that water and turn it to wine. And we know from Matthew and Luke and Mark that Jesus resisted the temptations. He rejected the idea in Matthew and Luke that the way he was to go about being the Messiah was to do spectacular signs that would make everybody know who he was and follow him and believe in him. He said, "Get behind me, Satan," to that, and chose a different way. That he would be Messiah, and the miracle of God's love and compassion would be shown not through him showing off his power, but through the relationships that he built and the trust that he would build with people. So I have a hard time believing that the reason and the purpose Jesus turned that water into wine was so everybody would know who he was and see his power and believe. I tend to go with Matthew and Mark that he chose a different way. And what I see in that miracle, when I really look at what the gospel says, and when I look at the other miracles of Jesus, I see something else that moves him to commit miracles. In this story of the wine and being turned into wine from water, he's at a wedding. His mother's concerned because they're out of wine and the host is going to be embarrassed, and maybe the host was related to her, maybe it was a friend, but she's concerned about that, and she goes to Jesus and asks him to do this. She says, "I know you've got it in you. I know you've got the power to be able to do this. I want you to do this." Jesus is reluctant at first. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to do that miracle. He says, it's not time for me to do things like this. which kind of matches what he said in Matthew and Luke. But it's obviously important to his mother and to the people. And so from the miracle of God's compassionate love, Jesus does it, even though he was reluctant to. The reason he changes the water into wine isn't to show off who he is, but is to respond to the call of God's compassionate love. Or if we put it in terms of the boulder and angel metaphor, when that boulder is put in front of him, he sees an angel and sets him free. In other words, when something of a great need is put in front of him, and we see it over and over and over again in the kind of miracles that he commits. He commits miracles when a need is right in front of his face, and he is moved by the compassionate love of God, by that miracle, to use the power he has, which is the full power of God, to set the angels free. We were made for the same miracles. That may be shocking to some of you. But Jesus himself, a little later in John, says, "These things you've seen me do, you will do these and more." You too will participate and help in proclaiming the miracle of God's compassionate love with the power that God has given you. Well, that power is not the full power of God, but each of us have some power, some gifts. It's what Paul's talking about in that letter to the Christians in Corinth, in that part we read. That we don't all have the fullness of it, but we each have gifts. We each have ways that God has given us gifts so that the Spirit of God will be manifest in us. And whenever we are open to the miracle of God's compassionate love working in us, we can't help but use those gifts and use them for things that set angels free. We've seen it happen in the history of the world, in the history of great leaders. We're partners with a Lutheran church. Our church exists partially because of what happened on the continent, and that Martin Luther opened the door for people to think about being something other than Roman Catholic in the West. We did it differently in England, but still he opened the door for that. He did it because he didn't decide one day, I think I'll get up and found a new religion or a new denomination of the Christian religion. He was a Roman Catholic priest who looked at the system of indulgences that charged people for masses to be said to get their loved ones out of purgatory, to build the wealth of the church, and to provide art such as Michelangelo's art. Yes, that's true. But it was at the expense, mostly of the peasant classes, who were concerned for their loved ones and didn't have the money to keep doing that. That's what first moved Martin Luther. He looked at that and he said, this isn't the gospel. And he was moved by the compassionate love of God, the miracle of that working in him, to use his gifts, which was a gift of being able to clearly state things, which he did in 95 Theses, his gift of courage, which he used in putting him on the wall, his gift of steadfastness, which when he began to be censured by the church he belonged to, allowed him to stand strong in what he believed the gospel had called him to do, even to the point where he was excommunicated finally. And even at then, when he was asked to simply recant, he could not, because his decision had been made in response to where he felt the Holy Spirit of God moving in his life to use his gifts. The Lutheran Church comes from that break, so does every other Protestant church that we have, including us, as I said, even though it was later in England before we did anything. Or look at another Martin Luther. Look at Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. First of all, a Baptist preacher till the day he died. He looked and was moved not only by his own experience, but by the experience of those around him, to be moved by the Holy Spirit, by this miracle of God's compassionate love, to take his gifts and to try to shed light on the situation that the Spirit was showing him. And so he used the gifts God had given him, gifts of speaking and preaching, gifts of insight, gifts of wisdom, gifts of courage, to be willing to put his life on the line, into several different times when he was thrown in jail, and finally till when he was killed for the gospel he proclaimed. His day is not just a federal holiday. He's on the church calendar of lists of holy men and holy women who we honor throughout the year. It was the Holy Spirit of God, the miracle of that compassionate love, that moved him to do what he did. But that same miracle works through you and me as well. Not on big scales, where we go out and put ourselves out on global issues most of the time. Maybe a few of us are called to that, but usually not that. Usually it's more just sort of everyday things. And the risks we take usually aren't about our lives or about our ability to remain in the church. Usually it's about our willingness to risk ourselves emotionally, or to risk thinking differently than we usually think. Usually those are the kinds of opportunities, the kinds of boulders that present themselves to us for us to set the angels free. And so I want to tell you the story of an incident that I was a personal witness to, where I saw the compassionate love of God being used through the willingness of two people to let their power do what it could do in each other's lives. I was at a friend's house. She was dying. This was during the last week of her life. And during that last week, she was coming in and out of consciousness. And all of us were gathered there, family. There was a little stepgrandson, about 5 or 6 years old, who had come into her life when he was about 3. And he asked if he could spend some time with her by himself. And she was pretty much awake at that particular moment, semi-lucid, enough to where we didn't think it would scare him. And so he went in, he picked up a little book. We all went out to let him go in by himself. He picked up a little book that she used to read him from the time he was about 3. And as he began to read, one of the games they would play, she was a teacher, one of the games they would play, is she would purposely say a word or two wrong and see if he could catch it. And he would. Every single time. He'd catch it when she said the wrong word and say, "That's not the word that's written there, it's whatever it was." And they'd laugh and go on. So he took this little book in. He was in there for a while. And then he came out. We were on the front porch. I was in a rocker. He came out and sat on my lap. And I said, "Did you have a good time with Gramps?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." And he just stopped. And he said, "You know, she couldn't read the words right." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he said, "No, you know, it's okay. She didn't know she wasn't reading them right, and I didn't tell her." That's the miracle of God's compassionate love. Working in a situation where the two people involved had very little power. No power to change the situation, and only a little power to be together in some way. Every time we do that, every time the boulder presents itself in our face, and we take whatever little power we have to let the miraculous power of God's compassionate love work through us. Every time we set an angel free. And every time, through us, God turns water into wine.